Um, so what I wanted to talk about today, first of all, is the material that's covered in Unit 3, which covers the notion of argument structure. We've talked about that a little bit, and the way in which the structure of an argument relates to validity, and then the way in which we can use methods of proof to assess the validity of an argument. So that's where we'll end up. So this is the same material that's covered in the handout that you've already looked at that was online, but I think it's helpful if we can go over it together to get some more background there. Have any of you started the homework yet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How's that going?
I had a couple questions, but for the most part, it was fine.
Okay. Well, we can come back to those two at the end, or maybe the lecture will clear up some of those. Okay. All right. So we've been talking about arguments this week, and a lot of the work that you guys worked on Wednesday were related to finding arguments in natural language. And we're going to continue talking about that today. So what is an argument? Well, an argument is simply a set of statements, the premises of which support the conclusion, right? So an argument is a set of statements, the premises, and a further statement, the conclusion. And now, the question that we face in moving from informal statements of arguments, as we might get in an ordinary paragraph in English, to formal statements of arguments, which are what we're going to be focusing on primarily in symbolic logic, is the problem of identifying what role the different sentences in an ordinary paragraph are playing when it comes to the more formalized structure of a logical argument. So here's an example. Professor Phelan is a Wisconsinite because anyone who lives in a city in Wisconsin is a Wisconsinite, and he lives in the Wisconsin city of Appleton. So this is a typical argument. What is the conclusion of this argument? So does anyone want to take a stab at it?
You're a Wisconsinite?
Yes. The conclusion is Professor Phelan is a Wisconsinite. And so to determine that, right, well, first of all, Sam, how did you determine that?
Okay, so the other statements are kind of more fact-like, they don't, Professor Phelan is a Wisconsinite doesn't seem like it's leading to anything.
Okay, good.
The other two start with like because.
Right, yeah, so the other sentences seem to be providing support for this first sentence. So in saying that, Sam, I think what you're doing is looking at the context of this sentence, looking at the kind of way in which the sentence flows in some way. And then additionally, you might rely upon a premise or a conclusion indicator word. Here, the indicator word that's at play is because, right? So because seems to be a word that is used to point to evidence for some claim. So typically, if you see a because statement, what comes after the because statement is going to be a reason or some reasons to accept what came before the statement. So this argument fits that bill. That's what's going on here. Okay, good. So that's one way in which we might identify the conclusion of an argument. So another example, so for our example, Professor Phelan is a Wisconsinite because anyone who lives in a city in Wisconsin is a Wisconsinite, and he lives in the Wisconsin city of Appleton. We identified what the conclusion was, perhaps using these indicator words. So here, the indicator word that appears is because, and that indicates the premises, right, as I was just mentioning. There are other words we might point to as well. We might see the word since, which functions in the same way as because, or for, as in Mark Phelan is a resident of Wisconsin, for he lives in Appleton, right? In that case, that for would be indicating that he lives in Appleton as a premise supporting the first conclusion. Or in that may be inferred from, given that, for the reason that, and after all. All of these are going to indicate the premises of a conclusion. The premises of an argument. Now, conclusion indicators, on the other hand, would include words like hence, thus, so, consequently, therefore, it follows that, as a result, accordingly, or it is a consequent at the most sort of obvious way. Okay? So these words are all words that help indicate premises and conclusions. It's not a conclusive list, and it's not always going to be the case that an argument you see in ordinary English will include one of these words. It may not. So in some cases, we have to rely merely upon the context, merely upon the kind of our intuitions about how the structure of the argument is working. Okay? So I think this is like anything else, something that we can get better at over time, identifying premises and conclusions and the structure of arguments. One thing I want to note at this point is that the same set of statements can be used to make different arguments. So here's one example of this. So Professor Phelan is a Wisconsinite because he lives in Wisconsin. Sorry, trying to get this up here. There. Professor Phelan is a Wisconsinite because he lives in Appleton. Anyone who lives in a city in Wisconsin is a Wisconsinite, and Appleton is a city in Wisconsin. So this is basically our argument from before. But we might have an argument that basically has the same content of this as this one, but has a kind of different structure, a different order to that content. So here's an argument like that. Professor Phelan is a Wisconsinite, and he lives in Appleton, and anyone who lives in a city in Wisconsin is a Wisconsinite. Therefore, Appleton is a city in Wisconsin. So as you can see, the structure here is very similar. We have the same order, basically, of the same parts, but this argument is doing something totally different. It's working to convince us of a totally different conclusion than the first argument, right? So what's the conclusion of this second argument? Example B. Abby, you want to tell us? Unmute.
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
What is the conclusion of the second argument, example B?
The conclusion would be Appleton is a city in Wisconsin.
Right, and how do we know that?
Because it's using therefore just before it.
Right, yep, because we have the indicator word therefore. So we might formalize these arguments, put them in a kind of numbered premise conclusion format, and in doing that, they would have a different structure, right? So this would be example A. Professor Phelan lives in Appleton. Anyone who lives in a city in Wisconsin is a Wisconsinite. Appleton is a city in Wisconsin. Conclusion, Professor Phelan is a Wisconsinite. Or we might have the second argument, which has a totally different structure in that. It looks like this. Premise 1, Professor Phelan lives in Appleton. Anyone who lives in a city in Wisconsin is a Wisconsinite. Professor Phelan is a Wisconsinite. And therefore, we could conclude Appleton is a city in Wisconsin, right? So same sentences, but different structure, different order to these things. What is being taken as the conclusion in one argument is a premise in the other, and vice versa, okay? Are these arguments valid? So what about example A? Is example A valid? Let's see, Owen, what do you think? Owen?
I think it's valid.
Okay, yeah. So example A is valid, it looks like here. Professor Phelan is a Wisconsinite follows from these other considerations, right? There's no way those other things can be true and this can be false. Nicole, what do you think of example B? Is it valid? Uh-oh, I think you might be muted.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, this one looks like it's valid too. So in both of these cases, both of these arguments appear to be valid. Okay.
I'm not sure that B is valid though,
Okay.
That's the same thing I was thinking about.
Why not?
because it says that premise 2, anyone who lives in the city in Wisconsin is a Wisconsinite.
Is this
It does
Simon?
not say that that is, yeah,
Okay, sorry.
it does not say that that is exclusive. So it's possible that there are other ways to be a Wisconsinite.
Sure. I see what you're saying.
So there, it could be like you were born in like if you were born in Wisconsin, you're a Wisconsinite, and you're currently living in California.
Oh, that's an
Therefore, it's
interesting
not
point.
necessarily true that Appleton's a city in Wisconsin.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, I hadn't considered that. That's a good point. So maybe there's some other way to be a Wisconsinite, in which case we wouldn't be able to determine if Appleton is a city in Wisconsin. So, okay, good point. How would we fix that? How would we fix the argument to make this valid?
Currently lives in.
Okay, so we could add currently lives in, but wouldn't Simon's point still stand there? Because
Well, I think if you put in like Professor Phelan currently lives in Appleton, anyone who currently lives in a city in Wisconsin is a Wisconsinite.
And that still has the same problem, though.
Does it though?
You,
Because it's
Well,
implying that at this moment.
Yeah, so let's swap this out, though. Let's say Professor Phelan lives in Dallas. Anyone who lives in the city in Wisconsin is a Wisconsinite. Professor Phelan is a Wisconsinite. And then let's add another one in there, which is anyone who is born in Wisconsin is a Wisconsinite. Professor Phelan was born in Wisconsin.
yeah, but currently fixes that because Professor Phelan doesn't currently live in Wisconsin. So then it's only people who currently live in Wisconsin that are Wisconsinites. So therefore, anyone who currently lives in Wisconsin, in a Wisconsin city, is a Wisconsinite. And the whole there is Professor Phelan lives in Dallas, which isn't a city in Wisconsin, which isn't in Wisconsin, and so therefore is no Wisconsinite.
I think
the
Simon
problem,
is
though,
still
is that it's one directional. So rewording number
right,
2 is
Simon.
if you live in a city in Wisconsin, then you are a Wisconsinite. It does not say if you are a Wisconsinite, then you live in a city in Wisconsin.
Okay, I see what you're
It's
saying.
only one direction.
I
How
don't
about
know.
how about this?
Here, let me say something real quick, okay? So I think what Simon does have a point here. What he's pointing out is that premise 2 gives us what's called a sufficient condition for being a Wisconsinite, but not a necessary condition for being a Wisconsinite. So if we change sentence 2 to say, anyone who lives in a city in Wisconsin is a Wisconsinite, and only people who live in cities in Wisconsin are Wisconsinites, then this would be a valid argument. The worry is, or if alternatively it said something like, only people who live in a city in Wisconsin are Wisconsinites. Right? Do you see the difference between that? Essentially,
Yeah.
like what Simon is suggesting is there could be 2 ways to be a Wisconsinite. Maybe living in a city in Wisconsin is one way, but maybe being born in Wisconsin is another way. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Right. So imagine that there are 2 ways to be a Wisconsinite. One way is to be born in Wisconsin, and one way is to currently live in a city in Wisconsin. Then a counterexample to this argument would be there are 2 ways to be a Wisconsinite: to live in Wisconsin or to be born in Wisconsin, or to have been born in Wisconsin. Professor Phelan was born in Wisconsin, which I clearly wasn't, but lives in California, Appleton, California, right? Then all of our premises would be true. It'd be true that Professor Phelan lives in Appleton. It would be true that anyone who lives in a city in Wisconsin is a Wisconsinite. And it would be true that Professor Phelan is a Wisconsinite, but it would be false that Appleton is a city in Wisconsin in that case. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, you get it, Nicole? You look like you're having some hesitation there.
It's I get the premise. I think it's just I feel like then I just feel like then in that case then there's no true I don't know. I understand it in premise.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Does that mean that it has to be necessary conditions in order to make valid arguments? It can't be sufficient conditions?
No, sometimes a sufficient condition will be enough to make an argument work, right? So think about example A. Example A, I think, is clearly a valid argument,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we still have that same sufficient condition built in there,
Gotcha.
right? So we don't have to have a necessary argument. If I were to write, I mean, to be honest, with the previous two groups, it was suggested this was valid, and I went along with the group. So I think Simon has come up with a really clever approach here to this argument. But if I were to write a counterexample based upon the objection that Simon raises here, what I would say, so when you create a counterexample, you essentially want to tell a story that ensures that all of your premises are true while your conclusion is false. So here's the story I would say. I mean, I've already said this basically before, but I would say Professor Phelan lives in Appleton, California, and it's the case that there's two ways to be a Wisconsinite, either to live in a city in Wisconsin or to be born there. And Professor Phelan was born in Wisconsin, right? So if all those things hold, then I think our premises all hold, but our conclusion fails, for example B, right? So this is useful because when you're presenting a counterexample, you want to tell a little story that preserves all of your conclusions, but preserves all of your premises, but renders your conclusion false. All right. Good example. So we'll move ahead now. Okay. So once we identify and order the premises and conclusion, we can inspect their connection to one another. Okay. And when we think about validity, what we're really thinking about is a relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Okay. So what is validity? Well, essentially an argument is valid for logicians, right? An argument is valid for logicians, not anything else. So sentences can't be valid for logicians. A point that someone makes can't be valid. I think we're all used to using valid to mean something like legitimate, right? So suppose you are hungry one evening and you're about to go over to Andrew Commons to get dinner, and you tell your friend this, and they say it's 8:30, right? You might say, oh, that's a valid point since the Commons closed at 8 or whatever, right? So we sometimes use in ordinary language the term valid to mean like this is a valid thing that you're bringing up. But that's not how we use the term in logic or in philosophy generally. If we use the term valid in philosophy, it always has to be applied to an argument. Validity is a feature of a set of sentences, and it has to do with the way in which those sentences, the premises, fit together with the conclusion. So here's our definition of validity. An argument is valid if the conclusion must be true in any circumstance in which the premises are true. The conclusion of a logically valid argument is a logical consequence of its premises. Okay? So these terms, logical consequence, validity, and I will also use the term follows sometimes, they're all interrelated to one another. If an argument is valid, then its conclusion is a logical consequence of its premises. Or we might also say its conclusion follows from its premises. Okay? All right, so now I'm just going to give you an opportunity to think about these arguments. I want you to think about our definition of validity and to assess these three arguments. So we'll call the one on the left here argument number 1, this one 2, and this one 3. So are these arguments valid? Just make the assessment yourself, and then I'll call on a couple of you to answer for us. Okay, you ready? All right, Maddie, why don't you tell us argument 1? Is it valid?
I don't think so, because it
Okay.
doesn't specifically say everyone where.
It doesn't say what? Sorry.
It doesn't say everyone considering where location wise. For example, the second one says everyone in the room. It can be valid, but then for the first one, you can always say since there might be other people, so not everyone is left-handed.
Okay, so can you give me a counterexample that makes the premises all true, but the conclusion false?
Maybe someone is not there today. I would say.
Okay. All right. I mean, we might just add another sentence, right? So we could say, how about this? Well, I think what you're getting hung up on here a little bit is this concept that we'll be studying later called universe of discourse or domain of discourse.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, that's what you're getting at essentially when you say the second one says the room, right, is the domain. This one doesn't tell us what we're talking about. We don't know if it's talking about some particular room or if it's talking about, you know, the state of Wisconsin or the United States or the world, right? And we don't know how many people or how many entities are in that domain, right? So a way to make these premises true and the conclusion false would be to say, for example, Juarez, Sloan, and Wang are all left-handed, but Charlie is right-handed, right? And those are the 4 people that are in the domain of discourse, and that would render this argument invalid. So yeah, I think you're right that this argument is invalid. How can we fix it up and make it valid?
Maybe everyone in this group is left-handed.
Yes, we could add everyone in this group is left-handed to the conclusion. Or we could say there are only 3 people, right? There are only 3 people, Juarez, Sloan, and Wang. And as another premise in here.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime you have an invalid argument, you can make it valid by adding more premises. But if you add more premises, you also necessarily decrease the likelihood that all of your premises are true. So you make it less likely that the argument is sound. But in this case, there's a very simple add-on that can make this argument valid. Okay, what about number 2? So this argument. Trinity, what's your thought here?
That one would be valid.
Okay, why is it valid?
Because it establishes that Jaylene and C are the only people in the room.
Right, yeah.
And everyone in the room is left-handed.
Right, yeah, these are the only people in the room. They're both left-handed. So the conclusion clearly follows from the premises. So this is a valid argument. Good. And then what about our last example here? So let's see. How about Maggie? What do you think?
I think it's a valid argument because Ottawa is, the capital of Canada, and then necessarily the capital of Canada is in Ontario, therefore Ottawa is in Ontario.
Yeah. You threw a necessary in there. I wouldn't say it's necessary that the capital of Canada is in Ontario, because it could have been, the capital could have been Vancouver or something like that.
For sure.
But yeah. But you have the you're right in pointing out why this is valid here. I think an important thing to note is that we use what's called a definite description here. Oops, the word "the," right? And so that suggests there's only one capital of Canada. There's not 2 of them out there, right? If there were 2, if it said Ottawa is a capital of Canada is in Ontario, then we couldn't conclude that Ottawa is in Ontario because it might be the other capital. But the fact that it uses "the" implies that there's one capital. Okay, good job. So consider this argument, and I want you to tell me right away whether you think this is valid or not. All roses are flowers. Some flowers fade quickly. Therefore, some roses fade quickly. So if you think this is valid, raise your hand. Now, Okay. Nice. All right, yeah, so some of you have identified this as a valid argument. In fact, this isn't a valid argument. We can see this by thinking about an argument that has the same form as this one. So this argument has the exact same form. All humans are mortal. Some mortals have feathers. Therefore, some humans have feathers, right? Now, these premises are both true. All humans are mortals, and some mortals do have feathers. Birds are mortals too, and they have feathers. But it doesn't follow that some humans have feathers from this, right? Just in the same way, we could say that all roses are flowers. That is true. And some flowers fade quickly. But it may be that this is true, that some flowers fade quickly is true because of all of the tulips, right? Maybe they're the ones that fade quickly. And in that case, it would be false that some roses fade quickly. So the truth of these premises does not entail the truth of this conclusion. So some of you got that wrong. I think if I'd made you answer more quickly, more of you would have gotten it wrong too. And those of you who didn't get this one wrong would get others wrong in other cases. And also you might just have not raised your hand in that case. So this argument, I mean, what this shows, Kahneman thinks, this is a point that Daniel Kahneman makes in this book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And Daniel Kahneman is this really important psychologist. He worked primarily in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even into today, but his career started in the 60s with a colleague of his called Amos Tversky. He really crafted this literature on heuristics and biases. So looking at these kind of systems that people have for navigating the world that are probably deeply ingrained in our minds and probably the result of evolutionary pressures. But these heuristics aren't truth conducive, right? They're basically designed to get things right most of the time, okay? So an example of a heuristic that you've already seen this term came from Unit 1, where we discussed the case of Lisa, a person who was committed to social justice issues and environmental issues in college. And you were asked the question, is it more likely that Lisa is a banker or that Lisa is a banker who voted against Donald Trump? And I think most of us in that case would, or many of us would say the second is more likely. But when we do that, we're falling victim to what's called the conjunction fallacy. Because a conjunctive statement is never more likely than each of its conjuncts. For it to be true, each of its conjuncts have to be true. So there are some situations where Lisa is a banker who voted against Donald Trump, but maybe there are others where she totally changed her political views later in life and she is simply a banker now, right? So we were led astray by this heuristic called the representativeness heuristic there. We tend to think that that what is most representative of a thing that is described is the thing that most represents the stories we've been told is most likely. But if we think carefully, we would see that no, that's not the case. Actually, just the single conjunct is more likely. And something similar is going on here. So Kahneman writes, this experiment has discouraging implications for reasoning in everyday life. It suggests that when people believe a conclusion is true, they are also very likely to believe arguments that appear to support it, even when those arguments are invalid. Okay? So in this case, we're falling victim to something that's called the my side bias, or the confirmation bias is another name for this. In other words, we already believe this thing, maybe, that some roses fade quickly. So because we believe that, maybe we're more likely to accept this argument. And that's a result of these kind of shallow processing mechanisms that are designed to be quick and to get things right most of the time, even if they're not absolutely accurate. So what we want to do in logic is really slow down and think about the way in which the different ideas fit together to try and determine what is actually correct. In other words, building on the topic of, or the title of Daniel Kahneman's book, we want to think slowly in logic and not to think quickly. And I forced you to think quickly there, so led you astray. Okay. So how do we get away from this kind of worry of too quickly falling victim to thinking that something is true or to think an argument is valid? Well, one thing we need to do is not confuse validity with the truth of premises and conclusions. So what it's really key for us to do in assessing validity is to determine the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Not to think about whether the premises and the conclusion are true, but rather to think about what would be the case if the premises were true. Like, would the thing follow if the premises were true? Okay, so here are two more examples, and I'll ask you again this time to raise your hands if you think it's not valid, okay? And maybe those of you have your video off can turn it on quickly just so we can all see here. So here's the first example. All humans are mortal. All mortals breathe fire. Therefore, all humans breathe fire. So do you think this is not valid? So you're answering if it's not valid. Okay, does anyone think it is valid? Who thinks it is valid? Show of hands. Okay. All right, yeah, this argument is valid, in fact. What about the second argument? All frogs are warm-blooded. If all frogs are warm-blooded, then all frogs give birth to live young. Therefore, all frogs give birth to live young. Who thinks this is valid? Raise your hand. Is valid. Okay, some of you do, but not too many. Okay, so in fact, both of these arguments are valid. They're both valid, and but they both involve false premises, right?
I have a question about the one with the frogs.
Yep.
So if you don't establish that warm-blooded things give birth to live young, then wouldn't the assumption that all frogs give birth to live young be not valid?
Well, so let's think about our second premise. What does our second premise say? It says, if all frogs are warm-blooded, then all frogs give birth to live young. So we don't really need to determine that all warm-blooded things give birth to live young, because this one tells us all warm-blooded frogs give birth to live young, right? So certainly if all warm-blooded things give birth to live young, then the argument would follow still. If we have all frogs are warm-blooded, all warm-blooded things give birth to live young, it would follow in that case. But essentially what we're saying here is all warm-blooded frogs give birth to live young, right? And the argument still works there. So I agree that there would be kind of a maybe broader fact we could point to about all warm-blooded things giving birth to live young that would still make the argument work, and maybe that's a little bit of the weirdness that's going on here. But if we lived in a universe where only warm-blooded frogs gave birth to live young and all frogs were warm-blooded, then it would still follow that all frogs give birth to live young. Does that make sense?
I guess so, yeah. I feel like then that kind of follows the same conundrum with the Wisconsin one, because you could have a premise in which warm-blooded things do not give birth to live young.
Well, okay, so imagine that we had, in addition to premise 2 here, premise 2 is if all frogs are warm-blooded, then all frogs give birth to live young. Imagine we also had a premise that said no warm-blooded things give birth to live young. Is that, I think, what you're suggesting? Then we would have a contradiction in this argument. There'd be an internal contradiction in it, right?
All right.
Yeah, so it's a bit different from the Wisconsin one because there was no adding that extra step or adding that extra idea wasn't in contradiction to anything that was stated. So yeah, this one does follow. This one, I mean, has been causing trouble for all the students all day. So I think it's like not surprising that many of you didn't get this one right. It's pretty weird. But I think we can see how it would work if we just replace frogs with cats, right? If all cats are warm-blooded, then all cats give birth to live young. Therefore, all cats give birth to live young. That strikes us as a valid argument. And I think the reason it does is because none of those premises or conclusion fly in the face of anything we already believe, right? What we're objecting to here, and what's leading us to say this argument is invalid, is the fact that all of these premises, every one of them, fly in the face of what we already believe, right? And so that makes it very difficult to assess. And so, I mean, that's why we're in this class, is we're trying to build the skill of assessing what would be the case if the premises were true, and not whether the premises are true or not. So both these arguments are valid, but they're not sound. In other words, they are unsound.
Okay, so then if you have an if-then statement, then that because I think part of the problem was I was kind of thinking it as like if each one of those were its own separate thing, but if-then statements can be their own premise, and assuming that the if-then statement is then correct, that forces the outcome to be correct.
Right, that's a good point, Nicole. So maybe you were thinking of if all frogs are warm-blooded as its own sentence, and then all frogs give birth to live young as a separate. Yeah, I can see how the formatting's a little weird there. Sorry about that formatting issue. I mean, if we had if all frogs are warm-blooded, that would be that wouldn't be a sentence according to logic. It can't be true or false, right?
Right.
Yeah, so this is meant to be read as one sentence. And so, I mean, we can think about the logical form of this argument, and we'll talk about that more next week, as being, I mean, we could replace this sentence, all frogs are warm-blooded, with a variable to stand for it, maybe the letter A, right? So we could say A. And then this is another separate idea. All frogs give birth to live young. We could replace that with B. And then our argument form would look like A, if A, then B, therefore B.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's clearly a valid argument. Yeah. All right, any other questions about that? All right, so both these arguments are valid, but they are unsound. And so what does it mean for an argument to be sound? Well, again, validity is just the idea that if the conclusion must be true in any circumstances in which the premises are true. Or to put it another way, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Soundness builds on this idea of validity. What it means to say that an argument is sound is that it is valid and the premises are true. So an argument is sound if it is valid and the premises are true. Okay? All right, so in this next part, I'm going to ask you to answer these two questions. And I'm just going to count to 3, and I want you to shout yes or no. Everyone to shout yes or no, okay? All right, so number 1, can a valid argument have false premises and a false conclusion? 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
So we got some no's and we got some yeses.
Wait,
So,
oh yeah.
So some people said yes. Those who said yes are right. So what's an example of an argument that is valid but has false premises and a false conclusion?
The one we were just talking about, right? With the frogs.
Yeah, the frog argument. Right. That has false premises and a false conclusion, but it's a valid argument. Right? If those things were true, then the conclusion would follow. All right, now consider this example. Can a valid argument have false premises and a true conclusion? So 1, 2, 3.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, lots of diversity there too. Again, the answer to this one is yes. Okay. false premises and a true conclusion. Does someone want to give an example of one of these?
Well, we could just go back to the frogs again and say that frogs are cold-blooded, but they still give birth to live young.
Okay. So,
Right. I think you mean that if that frogs are warm-blooded, but they don't give birth to live young.
No, because that would be that would mean the premises were true, the conclusion is false, which would mean is invalid.
well, frogs don't give birth to live young, though, so we don't want it to be the case that that's the conclusion, because that would be false.
Oh, true. Right. Yes. I was
So
still thinking
an
theoretically true.
Yeah. Here's an example of an argument that that has false premises and a true conclusion. Cats are fish. If cats are fish, then they give birth to live young. Cats give birth to live young. Right? That's a valid argument, but none of the premises are true, but the conclusion is. Right? Cats do give birth to live young. Okay. So that seems to follow. All right. So we've talked a little bit about giving counterexamples to arguments, and we know that if we give a counterexample to an argument, that the argument is invalid. But we face a certain problem here. So suppose you look at an argument and you think about it very carefully, but try as you might, you cannot imagine a scenario where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So what does that mean? Right? If you could think of an example where the premises are true and the conclusion is false, you would know that the argument is invalid. But since you can't do that, what does that show? Does that show that the argument is valid? What do people think?
No, you have to provide. Wait, I think I mixed myself up on the wording. Sorry.
Okay, anyone else? If I can't imagine a scenario where the premises are true and the conclusion is false, does that mean the argument is valid? Essentially, that's the question.
Sorry. Go ahead, Maggie.
No, I think you go for it.
Not necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Proof by lack of counterexample is not a good proof. It just means it could mean it is valid, and thus there is no counterexample. Or it could mean you haven't thought of a counterexample yet, and you just need to think harder.
Right. I mean, basically just what this point says. It could mean that the argument is valid, and that's why you can't think of a case where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. However, instead, it could mean you just haven't thought about it enough, and a counterexample just hasn't occurred to you yet. Or it could be that you aren't imaginative enough. Like, it's out there somewhere. Maybe if you just kept thinking about it longer, or you thought about it in a more creative way, you would come up with the example. So what we need is a way to prove validity, right? We can prove invalidity with a counterexample, a circumstance where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. But if we can't find a counterexample, that does not necessarily mean that the argument is valid. So how can we demonstrate that an argument is valid? Well, the solution to this is one that we're going to develop over the course of this term. What we can do is we can identify patterns of inference that are always valid and show that you can go from the premises in a given argument to the conclusion using just those patterns of inference, step by step. So we might ask, what is a pattern of inference? And the answer here is that it's a way in which we introduce a new belief based on our previous beliefs. So we've seen one pattern of inference already, and we've seen several, but the frog example brought up one pattern of inference, and that pattern of inference is, if we know if A, then B, and we know A, then we can infer B from that thing. This is a famous logical inference called modus ponens, right? And it's one pattern of inference we'll be studying this term. But there are many other patterns of inference that we'll study, and we know that these are always going to be truth-preserving if we're presented with true premises that fit these patterns of inference, then whatever they lead to will also be true. Okay? So we'll be studying patterns of inference and using those to prove that arguments are valid in a secure way, not simply because we haven't found a counterexample to them yet. So, last slide. So methods of proof are rules or patterns of inference for FOL. So we are learning FOL so we can complete formal proofs. In other words, so we can perform deductions on arguments. When we construct one of these, what it's going to look like is, first of all, we're going to write down some starting premises on a Fitch line. So this is called a Fitch line, okay? Essentially, when we construct a proof later on this term, our premises are going to go above this thing, which is called the Fitch bar. And then we will apply rules of inference to start these starting premises and go step by step until we reach the conclusion of our argument, which will be the last point in our deduction. And so later on, we'll be studying deduction and how to construct valid arguments using these patterns of inference. All right, do you guys have any questions about that before we turn to look at your group work from Wednesday? All right, so let's have a look at that. So I'm gonna stop sharing screen here. Okay, I'm going to move over here. Okay, and then I need to okay, it should be coming over. All right, so here's your homework or your group work from Thursday, from Wednesday. Okay, so here are sentences. A stitch in time saves 9. Is this a logical sentence? Is it capable of being true or false? And the answer here is yes, it is capable of being true or false, right? It may be the case that a stitch in time saves 9, but it may not be the case. It may be that a stitch in time saves only 3, or that it saves no other stitches, or it saves more than 9. Okay, so that argument is valid. It's capable of being, or see, I did that thing there. It's capable of being true. It's capable of being true or false. It is a logical sentence in our sense. Okay, next sentence. What is best said and who said it best? Is this sentence capable of being true or false? Well, again, you guys said no, and you got it right there. It is not capable of being true or false, right? We can't say, for example, it is true that what is best said and who said it best. Next example, I challenge you to a duel. Did you guys run into some trouble with this one or with the next one?
We definitely talked about this one and the next one a lot more than the others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I remember us talking a little bit about this on Wednesday. So these sentences, it seems like their primary function is to do something other than state the truth, right? I challenge you to a duel. Its primary goal seems to be getting someone to do something, right? To fight you in a duel. Or I marry this man. Its primary goal seems to be bringing about a new state of the world, a state where you are married to a certain person, right? So both of these seem to be in some way not as truth conducive as the others. There's this philosopher named John Austin who studied these kinds of sentences. He called them performative sentences. You might have heard this term, performative wokeness. I think some
talked
people
to us about that on Wednesday.
Oh, I did. Yeah. So that's like a way in which these seem to depart from that, but in fact they end up both being sentences in the logical sense. You got that right. The third one, don't move a muscle. That doesn't seem to be capable of being true or false. So you guys got that one right as well. All right. And then I haven't the time or the inclination. That seems to be true. I can say it is the case that I haven't the time or the inclination, or I can say it isn't the case that I have the time or the inclination. That seems to be capable of being both true and false. So good. All right, next example. Arrange each of these arguments into premise conclusion form. Number each sentence. We may conclude that texting while driving is wrong. This may be inferred from the fact that texting is distracting and driving while distracted is wrong. Okay? So you guys formalize this argument as follows. Texting is distracting. Driving while distracted is wrong. Therefore, texting while driving is wrong. And you guys got that one correct as well. Good job. Mark Twain lived in Hannibal, Missouri, since Sam Clemens was born there, and Mark Twain is Sam Clemens. So once again, I think that you guys used the clue word here, since, to identify the premises. So you identified Sam Clemens was born in Hannibal, Missouri, and Mark Twain is Sam Clemens as premises. And the conclusion again was, therefore, Mark Twain lived in Hannibal, Missouri. So you got that one right as well. All right, our currency will lose value, and as a result, our trade deficit will narrow. Because if our currency loses value, then it will be less expensive to buy our products. And if it's less expensive to buy our products, then more people in other countries will buy them. And if more people in other countries buy them, then our trade deficit will narrow. So for this one, you got our currency will lose value. If our currency loses value, then it will be less expensive to buy our products. If it's less expensive to buy our products, then more people in other countries will buy them. If more people in other countries buy our products, then our trade deficit will narrow. Therefore, our trade deficit will narrow. And you got this one right too. I think we talked a lot about this on Wednesday. There's a question about whether you break up what was the sentence, the first sentence in the paragraph. I think that's the more charitable way to understand this argument, because otherwise the argument doesn't work. You have this chain of connections between items, but you need something to kick that chain off, right? You need the first item to get the chain going. And I think also the fact that we have built into this as a result of suggests that this is in some way, our currency will lose value is in some way leading to this other thing, right? So it suggests that there's this kind of relationship of the first necessitating the latter that's built into that. Okay, fourth example. Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good. And for this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. So this is from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And you guys reconstructed this argument as, oh shoot, sorry about that. One sec. Okay, so you guys reconstructed this argument as follows. Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good. And then your conclusion was, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. Yeah, I mean, you could also break this up into separate sentences. And in fact, later on, when we learn sentential logic, we're going to be doing that. We're going to be breaking them down into separate sentences, these complex sentences like this. So what those sentences would be like premise one, every art is thought to aim at some good. Every inquiry is thought to aim at some good. Every action is thought to aim at some good. Every pursuit is thought to aim at some good. And then your conclusion would be, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. Did you guys think this argument was valid? Or?
Oh, sorry. We debated between breaking it up versus keeping it together. So we did talk about doing that and ultimately ended up deciding leaving it together.
Okay. Do you think this argument is valid?
I think we said in this context, like without more context, it's not valid, but
without more information.
What?
Without more information, it's not.
Yeah.
Valid. Yeah. So what could you add? What's missing here to make this argument valid?
I think saying that art, inquiry, action, and pursuit are the only things.
Right, yeah.
Or all things.
Yeah, so if you had an extra premise here that said something like, the only things are art, inquiry, action, and pursuit, then that would work. So I think this argument is I think that's probably what Aristotle intended. He thought of this as like an exhaustive list of things people might do. And so that would mean that he thought that was implicit in the argument. And so that would make this an enthymeme. And so that's a concept you may want to take down that you can think about later. Basically, an enthymeme is an argument where one or more of the premises are implicit in the argument. Right, so it's supposed to be, I think Aristotle is assuming people are going to infer that he means these are the only pursuits of human beings, right? Every pursuit of human beings can be considered either an art, an inquiry, an action, or a pursuit. And I think he's more explicit about that in the Nicomachean Ethics. So it may not even be an enthymeme there. It might be built into some other parts of the text. Okay. All right, so you did a good job with that one as well. Okay. If someone eats a pizza, they'll be full. You are full. Therefore, you ate a pizza. That's a good form for that argument. Again, the argument appears here. He's clearly there to identify the premise or the conclusion. And you all pointed out that this argument is invalid because you could be full because you ate a burrito rather than having eaten a pizza. And so you're right there. That's a good counterexample to this. You ate a huge burrito and that's why you're full. It's not because you ate a pizza. How could we make this a valid argument? As stated, make the argument as stated valid.
You could put in a premise that says like you can only be full if you eat pizza.
Yeah. Yeah, so we can imagine it's a world where you can only get full by eating pizza, right? Or a world that contains only pizzas as food items, right? So each of those kind of amendments would render this true. All right. Another example, all trespassers will be shot. All survivors will be prosecuted. So some trespassers will be prosecuted. This is a sign I once saw floating a river. Okay, so this argument is, I mean, it didn't have the last part, of course, just the first two. So this argument is invalid, right? As you guys pointed out, you got the right form there. And it's invalid because there's a chance that none of the trespassers will survive. Like maybe everyone will be killed. And therefore, the conclusion that some trespassers will be prosecuted is false. Okay. Next item. Everyone who owns a business votes Republican. Republican politicians support lower business taxes. Republican politicians support fewer business regulations. Those policies best favor business owners, and everyone votes for the policies that best favors them. That best favor them. So you guys have this correct. This one is one where you didn't have any clue words to help you identify what the conclusion was, but still you did a good job of identifying the conclusion and the premises that lead to it. So this argument is invalid because there could be other political groups that support the same policies, maybe support them more fervently, right? And that would render the premises true while the conclusion is false. So good job there. All right, last one. Johnny lives on the same street as Mary. After all, Mary lives on the same street as Jose, and Johnny lives on the same street as Jose. And you guys, I think you're the only group that got this one correct, so good job. So you identified Mary lives on the same street as Jose, Johnny lives on the same street as Jose, and Johnny lives on the same street as Mary. So this argument is invalid because Jose could have two houses that he lives at. One could be on the same street as Mary, and the other could be on the same street as Johnny. So good job. And maybe he lives on those exactly 50% of the year, in which case we would not be more inclined to say one is his true house and the other is not. We wouldn't be more inclined to say he lives in one than the other. All right. So that's all I've got for today. Do you guys have other questions for me?
So aren't we, we're supposed to update our like group answers, but we got them all correct. So we don't need to do anything there, correct?
Right. Well, they need to be updated by Thursday night. So this is your final version. Yeah.
Okay, they're already uploaded on Moodle, so I don't need to do anything else with them, correct?
Nope. I pulled these off of there, so they're all in place.
Perfect.
I have a question about the homework.
Okay.
Are either or statements, are they the entirety of a premise?
Give me an example.
So
They might be.
So for example, on the homework there's either I stop smoking or I risk getting ill. Would that be a premise itself?
Yeah.
Okay.
In that case, it is.
You don't need to like reword it because like one of them has an either or statement that's really, really long.
Okay.
Do we just leave it?
That same argument does, or a different one does?
It's the one that says either there are not health problems resulting from smoking that the government has to pay for, or it would save the government money to ban smoking.
Right. That is also an either or statement. So the either or there is playing an important part in that. Or is going to be one of 5 logical connectives that we study. So it is actually like important that is included in a single sentence. You don't want to split that up, if that's what the question is.
Okay, yeah, that was a question.
Okay.
So the way I think about it, I don't know if this helps, but the way I think about it is that the list is connected with implicit ands. So you can split anywhere there's an and just put another number in, but you can't
right, yeah,
or, because then you're joining it together with an and that changes the meaning.
Right, exactly, yeah. So it's like an and, right, if you have like Moggy is a cat and cats are warm-blooded, right, then you can split that and just make those 2 separate premises, because you could do that quite trivially using a logical function anyway. But it's really difficult to determine, if you have an or statement, right, it's really difficult to determine which of those things is the true thing, right? So an or statement is rendered true so long as one of the conjuncts is true.
Okay.
So an or statement can be true because one part of it is true, because another part of it is true, or because both parts of it are true. An and statement requires both parts of it to be true, so it could be broken up. But you should also just preserve the logical sentential structure of and statements as well for the time being.
Okay.
Anything else? All right, so good luck. On Monday, I will make new lectures available to you Monday morning, so you should get all those Monday morning. I won't have some of this slacking that I did this week next week. And then you will have a quiz that you need to take. Again, you need to take that before you do your group work on Wednesday. Then on Wednesday, you guys are going to get together through your link and discuss the problems that I've assigned you for group work. I will jump on there about 15 minutes to the hour to discuss any issues you're having. And then next Friday, again, I will see you back here to talk about logic again. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. Have a nice weekend, guys.
You too.
Bye.